evening, everyone. We'll finally get started. My name is Cammie Bassick. I'm co-director of programs for the League of Women Voters of the Palatine area. And I want to extend a special welcome to all of our League members from all over the state. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And if you are not a League member, but a member of the public, I thank you also for coming tonight to learn more about criminal justice. As almost everyone on here knows, the League is nonpartisan in that we do not support candidates or political parties, but we do advocate for issues. So we appreciate everyone being here tonight and hope you will also join us at the end of the month, September 29th, when we are doing another criminal justice program called Let's Talk Criminal Justice with members of our criminal justice study team. So now I am going to turn our program over to Laura Davis, who is the chair of the criminal justice studies team for the Palatine League. All right, Laura, you're up.
Okay, and thanks. Thanks everybody for participating in this really important topic, a discussion on criminal justice reform. And I am Laura Davis, and I'm with the League of Women Voters Palatine area. And I'm also on the League of Women Voters Illinois. For the last 3 years, we've been reviewing our criminal justice position. And it definitely needs updating. It has been 25 years since the position was last updated. And as you should know as a leaguer that it's important, and we take action on positions, and the way we come up with our positions is to study and then take a vote, a consensus vote. So in 25 years, a lot has happened in criminal justice. And we have added in more sections, and don't anyone get intimidated that there are 14 sections, but we added in things regarding like policing. We never had anything on policing. We didn't have anything on bias or gender or it just, I mean, so many different areas. And if you need any help with trying to manage this, please reach out to me or anyone else on our team. And we put all of the information and data on the League of Women Voters Illinois website. But one of the areas that we want to discuss is investing in a community. And that's why we've asked Sarah Staudt, who is the Senior Policy Analyst and Staff Attorney, to join us tonight and share with us her vast information and knowledge. And Sarah has been with the Chicago Appleseed since 2018. And as a senior policy analyst and staff attorney, Sarah works primarily on criminal justice issues. She graduated from the University of Chicago Law School in 2013 and was an Equal Justice Works Fellow. And before coming to work with Chicago Appleseed, Sarah was an attorney with the Lawndale Christian Legal Center, where she focused on juvenile justice matters. Sarah was also part of the team that planned, created, and launched the North Lawndale Community Court, which is the Restorative Justice Court, isn't it, Sarah? Yeah, which was managed by Chicago Appleseed staff for over a year. And a little background is Chicago Appleseed is an advocacy hub, and it leverages insights and best practices to make the court system more fair, accessible, and effective. So before I turn it over to Sarah, I just want to give you a few rules. We do have a pretty large group, and we welcome everybody, and we're going to have everybody on mute, and then please type your questions into the chat. And then Sarah will present for 45, 50 minutes, whatever, and then we'll allow some time to ask questions and engage. Hopefully we'll finish up at the latest by 8:15, but we understand if people need to click off. So everyone, thank you again. And Sarah, we're delighted to have you, and get started.
Great. Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen, and we're going to see if it works, which is always the first hurdle. Oh, I see what it's doing here. This is very smart.
Yeah. Everybody, please mute yourself.
Please, yes. Can everyone
Thank
see
you.
the PowerPoint that I'm looking at, or have I failed?
No.
You do or don't? We do? Okay, cool. All right, great. So as Laura mentioned, my name is Sarah Staudt. I am the Senior Policy Analyst and Staff Attorney at Chicago Appleseed Fund for Justice. When y'all asked me to come speak, you asked about sort of some really broad topics. And so I am going with, and I think also they are the topics that, particularly in the Chicago area, we are the most interested in right now and which are very much in the news right now, especially given the rise in homicides this summer. So I want to talk about criminal justice reform and community reinvestment. And I want to talk about it specifically in the context of gun violence, which I think is where a lot of our hearts and minds go when we think about why we need criminal justice reform and why we need a criminal justice system. So that's really where I'm coming from. Let me see here. Gotta get this started. Okay, so Laura introduced me a little bit. I'm actually a double U of C alum. I graduated with a BA as well as a JD. And before I came to Chicago Appleseed, I spent 5 years working in North Lawndale, which is on the west side of Chicago. And Lawndale Christian Legal Center is actually it's a holistic legal center that provides both social support and legal support. And it also is community-based and encourages its staff to live in the community. So much to my parents' utter joy, trust me, as a bright-eyed 25-year-old, I moved to North Lawndale to live and work there for 5 years. I loved it. The picture in the back is me with my mentee, who's one of my favorite people. And it changed my life in terms of the way that I see what's going on in Chicago and what's going on around the country in terms of the criminal justice system. And it is from that perspective that I'm sort of always speaking in what I learned from the guys and young women that I worked with. And so now that I do policy research, I basically look at what I saw when I was on the ground and think about what are some of the ways that we can find data and advocate for criminal justice reform that addresses what I saw. So I think we have to start any conversation by just describing what the problem is. And I think in criminal justice in particular, we often don't do this step. So we end up talking to people who think the problem is that not enough people are locked up, or the problem is that there's too much violence, or we haven't decided. And I think the best way to describe the problem is to hear from the communities that are the most impacted. So I'm lucky enough that one of the guys I used to work with, KJ, did a video presentation for the Marshall Project, where he really lays out sort of what it is like to be a young person living in North Lawndale and dealing with gun violence. And so I thought I would just start with KJ.
I was in about 5th to 6th grade, and one of my friends who was in 7th or 8th grade.
I'm gonna pause this and see if it'll buffer for a sec. It should work, but otherwise I'm gonna pull it up somewhere else.
He was a basketball player. He got killed.
Here, you know what I'm gonna do? Because this is a pretty important video. I'm actually gonna pull it up on, I turned off my screen share. I'm gonna pull it up on the Marshall Project and do it that way because I really wanna make sure that everybody sees it. And I think it will work better, unless my internet is broken. Okay, sorry. Just a sec. There's KJ. All right, now I just need to share my screen again. Let me see if I can do this effectively.
I was in about 5th to 6th grade, and one of my friends who was in 7th or 8th grade, he was a basketball player. He got killed outside of the basketball court. And that was the first time that death really hit home. And over the years, just lost more and more friends. Right here, long live GB. He was trying to change his life over, and he was killed. My friend who had got brutally killed by a police officer, we called him 2-3. That's Michael Jordan's number. It's crazy to say, but I'm just like, it's like at this point I'm used to it. My name is Kenneth Strong, mainly known as KJ. I am from the west side of Chicago in the North Lawndale area. North Lawndale, growing up, it was actually fun. You know, fire hydrants on the block, like 4th of July, it'd be a lot of fireworks. Like, it was fun growing up. I played football, I played basketball. We were freshmen playing on the varsity team. The Latino kids used to like mess with us a lot. And one time we just got in a fight with them. After we had the big fight, they didn't let us play sports anymore. So after that, I started to hang on the block more. Things changed. And I had to adapt to the changes. I didn't have to, but like, they were coming my way anyways. Shooting started happening a lot more. Sometimes we'll be playing basketball at the park and somebody would come through shooting. A lot of people started getting killed. At a point, I got tired of running from bullets. I just started picking up guns. My intent wasn't to just go out and kill someone. It was more for my protection because I wasn't gonna let nobody kill me.
I'm giving you my license and my insurance card. That's all.
I started getting stopped by the cops a lot more.
You know why I stopped you, man?
Oh.
You can't make a lane change in the middle of an intersection.
They'll mainly stop me and search me in to see if I have a gun.
Y'all can search for guns. We from out west.
The police see me as another gangbanger on the street. They never got the understanding of why we carry guns. And only if they knew that was just my way of surviving, they'll probably look at it different, you know.
Thanks for bearing with me here. Is my PowerPoint's back up, right? We all good?
Not quite yet, Sarah.
Okay, sorry.
You still have the video up on the screen.
How about that?
There you are.
Perfect. Sorry, I have not done the screen share thing before. So, so that you all do not end in suspense, I do want to say KJ's fine. The second half of that video is about how he got out, and it's a really great story. He was involved in our after-school program and got really involved in videography. We had a volunteer who came in and taught the guys how to use cameras, and she ended up founding a company, a videography company, who will be doing my wedding, which I'm very excited about, with a couple of the guys from the after-school program as business partners. And so KJ is great. KJ owns a business in downtown Chicago, and was able to sort of climb out of where he was. But I think that his description is really sort of gets at it all in terms of why it is that kids like KJ are in Chicago, are carrying guns, are stopped by police, and why violence looks like it does in Chicago. And there's a couple of things that I think I want to highlight. The first is obviously that he's just talking about just unrelenting violence. I mean, and this is something I experienced secondhand. I've lost 17 kids as of last week that I worked with to gun violence since 2015, which is awful and never gets better. It really creates a huge amount of trauma, a huge amount of fear, and just despair. You know, the way he talks about it and says, you know, I just kind of got used to it, is really striking. But he also talks about, although I'm sure he would not use this word, and if I used this word, he'd say, why, that's a giant word, and I'm just telling my story, and what's wrong with you, Sarah, because he makes fun of me for how I talk. He's describing maladaptive behavior, right, that's resulting from that trauma. So he's experiencing a lot of violence, and he gets in a fight at school, partially probably because he's on a hair trigger, because he's angry and stressed, and partially because he's 16, and 16-year-old boys get in fights, because there's one thing I learned working with teenagers, it's that 16-year-old boys are kind of dumb, although I love them very, very much. And he started carrying guns. And, he says, I didn't set out to kill anybody, but I didn't want to get shot anymore. What he doesn't say in this video actually is KJ's been shot. He was shot he went across the street to get a taco in a neighborhood he didn't know as well. He accidentally crossed a gang line, and he was shot 7 times and survived at age 15 and just carried a huge amount of trauma. So there's lots of stuff he didn't mention about the effects of this. Drug use, withdrawal from his family, suicide attempts, lack of focus in school, all of these things that are really a result of the trauma of how much gun violence these youth and young adults and everyone is seeing and experiencing. And this is my own thing. No one made this up but me, but this is really what I see as the way that our system interacts with that trauma. Gun violence causes trauma. There's nothing that will probably ever change about that, nor honestly would I want there to be. But from that trauma comes maladaptive behaviors. But the way we respond to those when we see those in our youth is with policing and arrest and prosecution. And that's where the criminal justice system comes in. Unfortunately, the policing and arrest and prosecution also leads to more trauma and more fear and more despair. And gun violence is also a result of that same condition. So what we're doing is our system is making this worse, not better. We know that trauma leads to criminal justice system involvement. Black Americans who have experienced more trauma are 4 times more likely to be arrested, 5 times more likely to be jailed, 4 times more likely to be sentenced to prison. We have an increasing understanding of the ways in which experiencing trauma as a child and witnessing violence changes our brain chemistry and makes it harder for us to self-regulate, makes it harder for us to control emotions. And it's not insurmountable, but if you don't have the tools to deal with that, it will not come easily to you, especially as a teenager. But we also know that criminal justice involvement then leads back to trauma. People who are incarcerated for just 3 days are 2.5 times less likely to be employed, 40% higher rate of unstable housing, 59% higher rate of reporting that their children have had major negative effects. Formerly incarcerated people are 10 times more likely to be homeless. And so we know that the criminal justice system and involvement in it makes things worse. So our response to crime is making the cycle of violence worse, not better. A lot of the first half of this presentation, by the way, is going to be me talking about all the things we do wrong. But I think it's really important to understand them so we can understand what to do right. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history and what we've tried so far. So we need to ask the question, the way that we police and prosecute and punish, we do for a reason. It didn't come from nowhere. The reason we say that we do these things is to keep communities safe from dangerous people, to encourage compliance with the law, and sometimes, and people vary about whether this is an appropriate use of the criminal justice system, but certainly we do it to an extent, to stop people from hurting themselves, right? We worry about people with drug addiction. There are some people who think that way about sex work. There are some who don't. But to try and regulate people's behavior so that we can take care of them. That's our intent. It has not been the outcome that our communities who are policed have seen. They have seen continued violence and dehumanization and racism. So how is it that our intent has gotten so far from our reality? So this is a graph of the US homicide rate. I bring this up because I think it's really important to understand the history here. Particularly if I'm a baby, you don't want to know what year I was born, but if you did grow up in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, I think it's very easy to assume that the situation now is similar to the situation in previous decades. And it's really important to understand where we're actually at. Speaking broadly, the modern era of criminal justice starts in the early 1970s, in the Nixon era. And homicides peak in 1980, which is way earlier, I think, than a lot of people think of a 90s crime wave. But even by the 90s, although there's another peak, it never gets as high as it does in the early 80s. But starting in the 70s, as crime rises, there's this huge flood of academic research, of political focus, and also just popular media that's focused on the rise of urban crime. I mean, it becomes all over our television screens, all over our politicians' talking points, so much so that by the 90s, it's really the center of, for example, Bill Clinton's major campaign in the 90s is really centered on criminal justice. Then the homicide rate fell, as did the rest of the crime rate, starting in the early 90s, actually before a lot of the tough on crime sort of reforms actually took effect. It had already started falling. And we reached an all-time low in 2014. There's been a little bit of a bump since then, but you can see on the graph, it's in comparison to the scales that we were at, we're in a different world. But despite that, we still talk about crime the way we talked about it in the 90s. And we still think about crime the way we thought about it in the 90s and the 80s. And that, I think, is part of the problem. The thing is, we think we understand crime because we think it's common sense. We think we understand why people do the things that we do. You know, they say common sense is not so common. Our common sense about criminal justice, a lot of which was developed in the 80s and 90s, it now turns out is fundamentally flawed. And you have to understand these underpinnings of what it is, why we think the way we do about crime, and what's wrong with that thinking in order to really understand why, for example, there are people marching in the streets saying that we should defund the entire system, which seems really extreme and seemed really extreme to me for a while, until you understand what they're actually attacking, which is the underpinning logic of the system we put in place through mass incarceration. So there's three. I'm going to go back to my college years when I studied criminology. There's three big theories and movements that we've all, I think, internalized about modern criminal justice. The first is probably the one that you think the least about. It's called broken windows, otherwise known as community policing. I'm going to explain what that is. The second is probably the most common sense thing that we ever think about, which is the idea of don't do the crime if you can't do the time. That the reason that we punish people is so people will not do the crime because they'll see that somebody else got punished and they won't do it. And the last is the war on drugs, Nancy Reagan and Just Say No, and the idea that there's a strong link between drug use and continued drug use and then continued crime. So I'm going to start with broken windows. The problem with all, well, sorry, I mixed this slide. The problem with all of these things, and this is the spoiler for the next section, they've unfortunately all been debunked. They were the basis for most of our criminal justice policy in the 80s and 90s. And it's important to understand that the social science that we based that on is wrong. And even if it seems like common sense, it still isn't accurate when we actually look at the data and the empirical evidence. And so as we envision a new world, we have to shed some of these common sense understandings of how crime works. So the first one of these is broken windows policing. And I would say I think I hear about it more now, but you probably have heard about it in the context of STOP-AND-FRISK. I think that's the one that's gotten to be the big talking point nationally. But I'll explain what it is. This comes from sociologists in the 60s. And they looked around neighborhoods and they did some research and they noticed that there was higher crime in neighborhoods where there were more literally broken windows, where there was more graffiti, where there was more disorder, where there were more dead flower beds and kids who stomped on pumpkins. What they ended up theorizing is something that feels very intuitively logical, which is that if you live in a neighborhood that all around you can see that people don't respect the community, that they break windows and put graffiti up on the walls, then you won't respect the community either. And you're more likely to commit crime, both big crimes and small crimes. So to fix crime, what we have to do in part is to make clear that the community respects itself. And that means stopping people from breaking windows. and making sure that people show proper respect in little and big ways to their communities. The big lesson that comes from this is this last thing, that if we punish people for small crimes, we'll prevent big crimes. That there's an escalation here, right? That the kid who tags the the viaduct, if you stop him then, maybe he won't end up selling drugs and he won't end up going down the path of violence. We have based our entire policing structure around the concept that this works. So what we do as in terms of how we run police in the modern era is we mostly look for small crime. We spend most of our time, in the 71% of the Chicago Police Department budget here is the Bureau of Patrol, right? We send cops out on the street to walk the beat and to look around their neighborhood for crime. Big crime, small crime, important crime, not important crime. We make sure that there's a really heavy, visible police presence in neighborhoods where there's high crime, and we impose tough punishments. We do a lot of arresting for low-level crimes. We do a lot of incarcerating for low-level crimes. And this is because we think it works. This is because it's based on this broken windows philosophy that reigned supreme for years and years and years. So we can see the effects. We arrest people for misdemeanors in Chicago more than twice as often as we arrest people for felonies. And obviously there are more misdemeanors than felonies in Chicago, but the question is, what are we arresting people for, right? Misdemeanor behavior can be, gambling and throwing dice on your front porch. It's not my favorite thing for people to do. We don't have to arrest people for it. We make that choice. The other thing we do is stop and frisk. So the idea is we're going to have police stop people, as they walk around, if they look suspicious, act on their hunches and check. See if they're committing crimes, low-level crimes, have guns, have drugs, are on their way to do something. The research has basically shown that stop and frisk doesn't work. We've had huge national experiments on experiments on stop and frisk. Basically, New York used it as a major policing tactic in the early 2010s. So we got to watch what happened. And unfortunately, what we saw is that once you controlled for background variables, like the fact that crime was already falling, stop and frisk didn't make a difference. It also ends up being incredibly racially disparate. We mostly stop and frisk Black and brown young men. So this is the percentage of Chicago that is Black versus the percentage of Black people who are stopped. And I think it's really important to see that, we are focusing specifically on Black and brown folks to the exclusion of other people when we use this kind of tactic. So, like I said, the problem is the broken windows theory isn't true. There was this initial false promise, which is one of the reasons why policing invested so heavily. As crime started to drop, these broken windows policing theories were coming into vogue. And so they were being implemented in cities and crime was going down, which seemed great. And it's very, very easy to assume that correlation is causation, right? We do that all the time. You'll find lots of media reports out there about how stop and frisk works great. If you look at the dates, they're probably going to be before 2014, because what we've learned since then is that actually the evidence points in the opposite direction. I mean, the Inspector General of New York says, the NYPD themselves basically says no evidence to prove that stop and frisk quality of life enforcement had any impact on reducing violent crime. So it doesn't work, and we're still doing it. Stop and frisk is the root, I think, of many of the problems between our police and our communities that are being expressed so loudly on the streets now. This is because stop and frisk is violent. It's violent and it's dehumanizing. In New York, they physically restrained suspects 12,000 times in 2 years, handcuffed people and drew their guns. 79% of the people stopped in New York were innocent. I will say this. I have read the New York numbers. I have also lived in North Lawndale and worked with young men in North Lawndale. The average number of times that young Black men in New York described being stopped was approximately once a week. From anecdotal experience, and I think that there's increasing empirical evidence, there's good reason to believe that Chicago's stop and frisk rate is twice or 3 times the rate of what New York was using at the height of stop and frisk. And we are still fighting to get that data from CPD. We don't actually know how often this policy is being used. We don't know how often CPD is pulling guns on people. We don't know how often they're handcuffing people. I saw it firsthand when I lived in Lawndale, and I was really shocked because, frankly, as a white person living in the suburbs, I had never seen someone stopped the way my youth were stopped in Lawndale. And seeing that and realizing made me really understand why my youth didn't have any positive associations with the police at all. Because their major source of contact with the police, since they were usually 8 or 9 years old, was violent, very scary confrontations where they often really did fear for their lives. And of course, what's particularly sad is that we've seen that some of the most high-profile cases of deaths at the hands of police officers have been in the middle of these stops for nonviolent crime. Eric Garner was selling loose cigarettes. George Floyd was being stopped for sort of acting strange on the side of the street. And the fact that that's where these things start is a very good reason to avoid the practice. That's number 1. Number 2, this one is, I think, the bigger one that I always have a harder time convincing people isn't true, which is the concept of general deterrence. If people see that a certain crime carries a heavy punishment, they will stop doing it. The heavier the punishment, the better the deterrence. The reason we think this works is because it works on kids, and it works on dogs, and it works on, people with brains. We know that to a certain extent, we all sometimes refrain from doing things because we know what the consequences will be. I will set out to say, in the context of violent crime, there is this concept which seems so common sense isn't real. We know we tried really hard to deter crime with very high punishments and the death penalty. It didn't work. We didn't see any changes in terms of the death penalty reducing crime rates. In fact, states with the death penalty had higher crime rates. And as we've started to reform the criminal justice system and lower incarceration rates, crime has continued to go down. It hasn't gone up. Prison, and we know also that prison actually makes people more likely to commit crimes when they get out now, rather than less likely. So all of the empirical evidence points against this common sense idea that people won't commit crimes if they have serious punishment. At this point, 88.2% of criminologists don't think the death penalty deters murder. That's a level of consensus comparable to the agreement among scientists regarding global climate change. And I really want to emphasize this because we're hearing it from our politicians at the national and state level still, that if we're hearing, unfortunately, at the national level, if we use the death penalty, drug crime would go down, violent crime would go down. Locally, we're hearing we need to increase punishments for this, that, and the other thing. This is such a disproven theory that we can think about it the way we do about climate change deniers. And I really think that's important to understand because we still hear it way more often from otherwise very evidence-based politicians than we do climate change. This is my favorite graph, which I have to trot out all the time. I have been very active in the decarceration of the Cook County Jail. It's been a huge success. Since 2013, we have halved the population of the Cook County Jail. That is thousands and thousands of people who get to be home with their families, awaiting trial while they are innocent. Every summer, there are endless stories about how this decarceration effort must be leading to the summer's violence. This is my graph that I point out that this is simply not true. As the population of the jail has decreased, shootings and other crime rates have also decreased. There is simply no connection between decarceration just on the local level and any rise in violent crime. So why doesn't it work? It seems like it should. it's really because of what violent crime particularly is. Most people don't make rational reasoned decisions when they're committing crimes. Most of them don't know how long the punishment would be for what they're doing. And they're motivated by something that is very, very separate from the kind of rational decision making that the rest of us do every day. Some are motivated by poverty or economic factors. Some, like KJ, are motivated by self-preservation, and a lot just don't think it through. A huge amount of violent crime is perpetrated by people under the age of 25, whose frontal cortexes are not fully developed. Okay, this is one of my favorite stories, so I'm gonna do story time. So we had a program at Lawndale Christian Legal Center, I love this program. If you ever run a program for youth, this is super fun. The kids were on a panel, and their parents were in the audience, and their parents could ask them questions about what it was like to be a teenager, which was super fun. So Tyrese, who is wonderful, who was 16, and had, it should be noted, for context, just come back from the hospital because he rode without a helmet on the back of his friend's moped and fell off the back and scraped up his leg because he's 16 and 16-year-olds do dumb, dumb stuff. So his mom is in the audience and raises her hand and goes straight to Tyrese and says, "Why is it that you guys make such dumb decisions?" And this is what he goes. He goes, "Okay, it's like this. So a lot of times I'm thinking about doing something dumb, dangerous, and I think, oh man, I shouldn't do this. This is gonna be good for me. Then by the time I finish thinking about that, I look around and I'm like, oh shit, I already did it." Like, kids are terrible at impulse control. Young people are terrible at impulse control. By the time they've finished thinking through whether or not something is a good idea, unfortunately, they have sometimes already done it. All right, bad theory number 3, and this is one you've probably heard of. Zero tolerance and the war on drugs. This is based on the idea of how we understand the relationship between drugs and guns and crime. Abstinence and going cold turkey is the best way to get rid of addiction. People with addictions are violent, and if we stop the drug trade, we will stop gun violence. This is Nancy Reagan, just say no. We spent $1 trillion on the war on drugs since it was declared by President Nixon in 1971. $1 trillion. We now understand, to the extent that the war on drugs was ever motivated by fears about addiction, we now understand that it doesn't work. Initial drug use and continued drug use, we know increasingly, are a health problem. They have genetic precursors that are similar to the genetic precursors that lead to alcoholism. Drug use is also driven by trauma and social isolation. So when we have zero tolerance problems for drug use, we tend to increase substance use. And probably the most frustrating part for me, because I've seen it personally as well, is, you know, as we've done reform, we've started to think about criminalization of drugs as a way to get people into treatment in jails. And unfortunately, what we've seen, and this is more recent research, is that it does more harm than good. Treatment that's mandated by courts is way less effective than voluntary treatment. And for drugs that involve tolerance, particularly heroin and opiates, incarceration is deadly. Keeping someone incarcerated who's a heroin addict decreases their tolerance. And if you don't give them appropriate treatment, when they relapse and use the same level of drugs they used before they were incarcerated. And it's a very, very common cause of overdose. So again, we're unfortunately doing more harm than good. With the war on drugs, though, it was only ever sort of true that the war on drugs was really about drugs. More than any of the other policies that are involved in criminal justice, we know that the war on drugs was always a racially motivated policy. This quote from John Ehrlichman completely floored me when I first read it. And what he says is, you want to know what it was really all about? He was talking about the war on drugs. The Nixon campaign in 1968, the Nixon White House after that, we had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black. By getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. I really think that this sort of basic confession is important to internalize. so much of our drug policing never had valid or, reasonable bases. It was always political before it was about safety. We can see this is just an easy graph. White and Black people and Latinx people use drugs at approximately similar rates. Actually, white people use drugs slightly more. So here's illegal drug use. The one at the bottom is all illegal drug use, with your red bar there being 57% of white people by the time that they are 26 have used illegal drugs. And here's the Cook County narcotics arrests for 100 people from 2011 to 2020. It's really pretty stark, the difference between who we arrest and who we know uses drugs. And it makes it really clear that race has always been a big part of what the war on drugs is about. So these three theories, now we're gonna move on, I promise, to the positive part of the presentation. These three theories, when we keep them in our head, have led to some stuff that I'll go through quickly, because I'm sure you've seen it, of just how bad things have gotten in terms of incarceration and in terms of policing. We know that we have unprecedented arrest, prosecution, and incarceration, and that it's primarily affecting people of color. There's a couple different big ways that this has happened. One is the number of cases moving through the criminal justice system when you police like this is huge. There are so many cases moving through every single day that it makes people sloppy. We don't have time to investigate cases carefully. We don't have time to build good evidence, and we get bad outcomes. We also have extremely punitive sentencing laws, and we're spending massively on jails, prisons, and police. This, you have probably seen before, is the federal prison population and US and state prison population. We are so completely out of bounds from where we were in the 60s that it really, when I look at this graph, I don't see how anyone can see this as anything other than a crisis. This is a useful graph, I think, because of what's on the right. As well as increasing our prison populations, we've also increased the number of people we're supervising at home in probation. And as we do more reform and use less prison, we end up using more probation. So that number has skyrocketed up to 3 million people, 3.5 million people really, who are being supervised on probation in their communities and sort of are always at risk of going back to prison. And of course, the racial disparity is very, very obvious. That's the Black men line. And we know exactly, we know exactly why that is after looking at, 4 decades of policy. So what do we do? I think there's two different ways to think about fixing the criminal justice system, and they're often conflated. And I think finally, as we start to talk so much more about funding and defunding and what they mean, we're teasing out what these two steps are. The first is reform. We have to fix what's actually broken in our system, and as much as we can, repair all of the harm that we've caused. That's a huge, tall order. Then, since we know that that doesn't work, we can't just keep doing it. We then have to reinvest in ways of solving violence that actually work. And it turns out that most of those involve investing in impacted communities. And there are ways to reduce violence. We have had success. It just hasn't been through our criminal justice system. It's been through community reinvestment. So how do we undo the damage? There's 3 big ways. First, we have to arrest and jail and prosecute fewer people. This is a slide, this slide is kind of me going on a rant, but I really do like to drive this home. We are in charge as a society of deciding what is and isn't a crime. We get to decide whether or not we want to arrest and prosecute people for certain behavior. There's no rule that says we have to arrest jaywalkers. There's no rule that says we have to arrest people who possess narcotics. There's no rule that says we have to arrest people under 18. We can change all of those rules. There's no rule that if we arrest people, we have to handcuff them, jail them, or prosecute them. We can do that a different way. And there's no rule that says that armed police in the traditional sense are the only people who should be able to make arrests or intervene in behavior. You know, the world of reform is so much bigger than moving a couple dollar signs around or changing a couple laws. We have the power to change everything about the way we think about this system. But what we have to do is decrease the number of people we're arresting and jailing and prosecuting. There are too many of them. There are so many more of them than was in the 70s that we have to like extend the scale on our graphs. We have to reduce that total impact. Here's some Illinois specific steps. And this is admittedly me talking about stuff that I work on, but I think it's important and you should all support it. End money bond. Right now, we make a decision about who should be jailed pretrial based on how much money they have, instead of looking at the circumstances around the arrested person and the offense. The truth is, almost no one poses such a risk to the people around them that they absolutely need to be jailed pretrial. Only about 0.6% of people get rearrested for a violent crime while they're released. But by using money as a way to basically ransom people and decide whether they're in or not, we have unnecessarily high jail populations with lots of people there who don't need to be there, and we massively drain resources from minority communities. Most people don't pay their own bail. In fact, almost no one pays their own bail. Most people who go through the criminal justice system don't have any money. Their grandmas pay their bail. Their moms pay their bail. Their girlfriends pay their bail. Their sisters pay their bail. I think actually that this is a huge gender issue, and it's often something that I get on my soapbox about, and people get tired of hearing it from me. But Black women, for the most part, are the economic victims of cash bail. They are whose money we're taking. And whether, even if we give it back eventually, we give it back after, a year or a year and a half of a case. And if you don't live in Cook County, we only give 90% of it back, that can be really substantial in terms of if you're living paycheck to paycheck, losing 10% of the money that you paid in bail is not insignificant. In Cook County, we only take 1%. But still, you have to understand that people don't have money to spare. And they're basically instead of saving the way we would like them to, they're storing their money in the courts. We need to defelonize drug possession and we need to decriminalize addiction. Like I said, there's an act called the Pretrial Fairness Act. It does in fact end money bond and replaces it with an evidence-based system that actually looks at who's dangerous and who's not. We do not have a bill number. We will have a bill number, and I will send an email. I would love your following and support. I think it's the single biggest thing we can do to change incarceration rates in Illinois as a whole. The second thing we have to do is defelonize drug possession and decriminalize addiction. Most states have a way to charge misdemeanor drug possession. The reason they have that is for addicts, for people who use drugs and need help. Illinois doesn't have a misdemeanor version of drug possession. Everybody we arrest with any amount of narcotics, we have to charge with a felony. That's a huge problem, and it's a fixable problem. We also need to fix the problem that once people are in the system, they're often subject to zero tolerance policies on use. And now we know that relapse happens. We have to have a criminal justice system that understands the science. So those are my two big ones in terms of decreasing the number of people who get arrested, prosecuted, and jailed. Step 2, we have to decrease punishments and incarceration. It's my second soapbox. Illinois has the harshest penalties for gun possession and gun use in the country. Anytime someone says Illinois needs to increase their penalties for gun possession, I want to pull my hair out. And the reason is because truly, we are the highest by a substantial amount. We have enhancements that are 3 times the enhancements of our of Wisconsin or Indiana or Iowa around us for gun possession. It hasn't made a difference. And the reason it hasn't made a difference is because of what I said about deterrence up there. So anytime I hear that particular policy, anytime you hear that particular policy suggestion, if I leave you with nothing else, please know that there is no world in which we need to increase Illinois' gun sentencing. It's already way above where it needs to be. We need to eliminate mandatory minimums and life without parole sentences. In Illinois, those two things go together. For the most part, our mandatory minimums and life without parole come from our gun statutes. So if we start to decrease the amount of time people spend in custody, we will start to end massive incarceration overall. Decrease pretrial incarceration, which I've talked to. There is a bill that called HB 2039 that works on this last part. Once people are in prison, we have to be able to let them earn their way out. Otherwise, they're really just sitting with absolutely no motivation or, way to come back to society. So HB 2039 starts that process of helping more people basically have access to the programming that they need to decrease their sentences once they're already in. The last thing we need to do is repair the harm that this system has caused. Obviously, police accountability is a big part of this. I could do a whole presentation on that. But we also need to do other things like expunge people's criminal records, where we've basically saddled a whole generation with criminal records they can't get rid of. We should get rid of them. We should pass laws that stop employers and housing from using criminal background checks to exclude qualified applicants. And unfortunately, just telling them not to do it has been very ineffective. So we need to make sure the records themselves don't exist because unfortunately, states that have simply banned the box and had employers not ask, the employers tend to just look it up themselves anyway. We also need to increase the accuracy of our courts. Right now, I mean, the kids I worked with, people would say, oh, do they have no respect for the rule of law? The reason they had no respect for the rule of law was that so many of their friends had been arrested and were innocent. My kids, especially the juveniles, really pretty much felt that it was 50-50, that they would be walking down the street and get arrested for something they didn't do, or they would be doing something and they'd get away with it. That's not a great way to create trust in your criminal justice system. We have to decrease caseloads so that people can pay attention to these cases. We have to invest in criminal defense, educate judges, and my favorite, gather and analyze big data. We have in these piles of data the answers to where the worst parts of the problem are and where we need to target our efforts. We just have to look at it, which is what I spend most of my time tinkering around with, both when I have time at work and in my free time, because it's super interesting. Reinvestment. So this is the other part. Let's say we fix the whole criminal justice system. We could fix the whole criminal justice system and we will still have very, very high gun violence because none of those things fix the problem. To do that, we have to reinvest in solutions that actually work. Right now, we don't fund what works. We fund what doesn't work. Chicago police spending is $1.6 billion on 13,000 police. We actually spend more than the average large city. The second largest budget in the US. My personal pet peeve is that one of the things we spend that money on is misconduct lawsuits. When our police break the law and get sued, we are projected in 2020, we budget for this now, which drives me nuts. We budget, we know we're gonna spend $153 million settling misconduct cases. That's insane. And meanwhile, our anti-violence efforts are underfunded, even in comparison to our peer cities. So in 2019, a group of organizations got together and said to Lori Lightfoot, look, we need $50 million for community-based violence prevention, which again, I would point out is a third of what we spend on police misconduct lawsuits. Instead, they got $11.5 million. We know we're not funding what we know works. So let me give you some examples of, and this is another sort of rather striking graph of where our money goes, right? Police department spending versus all of our spending on youth services, homeless services, mental health services, social and veteran services, behavioral health, substance use, disability, domestic violence, all things that we should be funding at much, much higher levels. So I think a lot of times when we hear defund the police, because it's not a new concept, but it's one that's moved into the mainstream very recently. I think a lot of people haven't yet seen what an actual defund or reinvestment proposal looks like. So I thought I would give you one. This literally came out yesterday. It's supported by the Shriver Center for Poverty Law, Chicago Community Bond Fund. The Nurses Union has been really active in this, of all things, in part because they're very active at the jail. And this is what reinvestment looks like. When people are saying defund the police, this is what they're talking about. So here's the proposal. The proposal is the sheriff of Cook County has a budget of about $590 million. So about $500 million. The proposal is we cut a quarter of that, $157 million. What do we use it for? We use 60 million for housing, which would be the most that Chicago has ever spent on affordable housing. We use 22.8 million for violence prevention. We reinvest in our mental and community health systems, which are facing big cuts this year, in part because we're still spending so much money on policing and jails and then cutting our health services. And then we also spend on other community programs. It's an interesting list of things. They're all things that the community asked for. One of them is broadband internet service. Just to say, this is something that we need in order for people to have, be able to get jobs. There are basically a couple of principles that we know this is what works to approach crime and poverty. And they're really sort of what you'd think they are. Targeted. They focused on those at highest risk. There aren't blanket rules for the whole communities. That means, and this drives people crazy, that yes, we do reward people with jobs for being high risk. You have to target programs at the people who need them the most. And that means we have to, get rid of this idea about who's deserving and focus on what's actually going to reduce crime. They have to be local. They have to be led by the community. North Lawndale has a border with Little Village, La Velita, 99% African American on one side of the viaduct, 99% Latinx on the other side of the viaduct. Those communities are literally blocks apart, and everything about the way we do youth services is different. Just as an example, we had two sort of twin organizations. Everything about how we did youth services was different, and it's because the communities had different contexts. The interventions have to be positive. Jobs, school, personal development, and trauma informed. People who experience high trauma also experience a lot of outbursts. They experience a lot of just dysregulation. And that means that things like mandatory attendance policies or, one strike you're out kinds of jobs, use it or lose it, which again feels like we're teaching responsibility, actually is setting up people who have serious trauma or failure. Here's a program that works. This is a program called Ready Chicago. It targets people at highest risk of committing gun violence. Literally goes out and goes, who is most likely to shoot someone? And it says, rather than arrest them, let's give them a job. It gives them a transitional job for a year, along with cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma-informed care, and mentorship. This program is amazing. When it showed up in Chicago, it was suddenly a way for guys who couldn't get a job anywhere else, who had never had a job, who could never build by themselves the skills to get a job experience where people would meet them where they were at. What they do for work, it's a little bit like old FDR New Deal policies. It's not quite dig a hole and fill it again, but it's, it's picking up trash. It's, cleaning up abandoned buildings. It's doing basic, manual labor community beautification stuff, but it's a job. It pays people money, it teaches them work ethic, and it gives them therapy, which is often something that they wouldn't do unless it was tied to a job. Ceasefire is another major program, which is a violence intervention program that actually goes out to the streets, figures out who's going to shoot people, shoot each other, and tries to mediate. These are the drops in shootings in each of these targeted locations. You can see that it's not all of New York or all of Chicago or all of Philly. It's specifically the parts of the city that had the highest need for these programs. Here's one thing that I'm noticing, and it was on the paper literally yesterday. We have been trying these programs for a while. Anti-violence programs aren't new. They are, however, though, usually not government funded. They're often funded by private organizations, by nonprofits, and we're getting to the point where these programs are 5 years old, 10 years old, and we're running out of private money. It's time to stop doing pilot programs. We know what works. We need to make a major structural shift in funding. And that's why you're starting to hear calls to defund the police and to defund our jails, because the money can't just be a little bit a year. We have to massively switch over to what we're actually funding to address violence. There's a couple, I'll move to the end because I'm going quickly. There's two other things that I want to talk about. One is another success story, another thing that's going on in Illinois. Illinois just announced that we are overhauling our juvenile prisons, and it's a really good model for what a world without prisons would look like, or at least juvenile prisons. In the next 5 years, I want to say, Governor Pritzker has said he's going to close all 6 of the remaining juvenile prisons and replace them. He's not getting rid of the ability to incarcerate people under the age of 18, but he's replacing them with short stays in local facilities that are sort of dormitory style and close to people's homes, so that their parents are within, quick driving distance, as opposed to having to drive hours, especially in downstate, to see their children, with a focus on repairing mental health and trauma treatment and repairing relationships. All of this is also cheaper than prisons. And the last thing is restorative justice. Restorative justice is a big term, and again, I could do a whole presentation on it, and I'm happy to come back and do one sometime, but the basics is this. We have to let communities decide what the appropriate way to hold people responsible for harm is. We can't come in from outside. We know that as a city and as a state, we are a community, but that also we live in our own neighborhoods and we live in our own cultural contexts. And we have to make sure that people are able to make the decisions when they're harmed and the people around them are harmed, what should happen. There are a million different processes that have been developed to do this work, and many of them predate the criminal justice system as we know it, but it's everything. It's peace circles, which is a sort of structured group conversation, victim offender counseling, mediation. But the goal is to repair relationships and restore the community. It's not to get an offender out of the community and away from where he can hurt somebody. It's about bringing him back into right relationship with the community. And although restorative justice is hard to test effectiveness because it's not measured that way, right? It really is about sort of people's satisfaction with their justice system and satisfaction with their communities, but it's an incredibly important way to restore trust with communities. I will end with a quote from Michelle Alexander. As a society, our decision to heap shame and contempt upon people who struggle and fail in a system designed to keep them locked up and locked out says far more about ourselves than it does about them. So I'd encourage everybody, as you look at criminal justice, to do so with a mind towards trying to bring people back into our communities and into right relationships with the people around them, rather than locking them up. And that is me. Sorry, I know it was a lot, but I thought I would open it up.
There's so much to say about it. Thank you, Sarah. And you really, really shared loads of information. We do have several questions. And I do want to get started a little bit, which something that kept coming up is this data information and transparency. And particularly the Chicago Police Department and trying to get data.
Yes.
And along that, I remember the consent decree came out, and I believe part of that was requiring officers to even document when they pulled their guns out.
Yep.
So what is the difficulty with getting data?
Well, there are a couple of things. So I would say this: the biggest one is pure compliance, and it's really not something we would tolerate from almost any other agency. But it really is amazing how much the CPD has simply refused to gather the data they're supposed to. I think my favorite story is they're supposed to give stop receipts now. They're supposed to write a little ticket when they stop somebody and give it to them. And if you ask the CPD, they'll say, well, look, we're not making as many stops. Look, here are the stop receipts. I asked my guys if they'd ever seen a stop receipt, and I kept asking everybody I worked with, I represented 200 of them. I interacted with hundreds of kids, whether any of them had ever received a stop receipt. One of my guys remembered, and he said, oh, you know what? One of the officers tried to do that, and then but she was new, and her partner just leaned over and was like, "Oh, you don't have to do that shit," like while they were stopping him. So, you know, like this is the kind of thing of like, we have to enforce real compliance here. And it's a leadership problem. Ultimately, until you actually get leadership all the way from the mayor's office to the superintendent's office and down, and hopefully some sort of meaningful civilian police review, we're not getting that data. It's not happening. The whether they point their guns question is actually one of the major holdups in contract negotiations with the union. Chicago police officers really don't want to have to write down how often they point their guns at people. There is a reason for that. I've watched a lot of body camera. They do it a lot. And it is incredibly dangerous. I mean, just shockingly dangerous that we allow that practice to go unmonitored and untouched.
Okay, so along the issue of data, I just want to explore, because it seems like you can't make really good moves forward. I mean, you mentioned some of them have been, some of these good interventions have been proven, and I'm curious about some of that research. But there's data lacking, I think, even within the jail. I know there's been pushback from Sheriff Staudt, and it shouldn't be that hard to get information. Or how many people are being admitted and for what crimes?
Yeah.
When we have some statistics on that.
Well, so, I mean, the sheriff helpfully is subject to FOIA. So that's actually a lot of what I do with my time. I actually, especially recently, I'm getting a monthly jail roster now of exactly who's in the jail, everything they're charged with, what their bond is, you know, and I have that information. It is, frankly, there need to be more people like me. I'm trying to find funding to fund more analysts like me. Lawyers don't like to add. I think I'm the only lawyer I know who also knows how to analyze data. Generally, the two skill sets are not found in the same person, and we really need some more cross-training. One of the problems we have in the court system, though, another uniquely Illinois problem, our courts are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act in Illinois, which is my #1 pet peeve.
Oh.
No one intended it to go this way. So the Freedom of Information Act was amended. Kwame Raoul championed who's our Attorney General, championed the most recent FOIA reform in 2012. Because they didn't define the word judiciary. So they basically said, well, the judiciary is exempt from FOIA. And what they meant was, you can't FOIA a judge's notes during a trial, right? That's like a pretty common, judges get a certain amount of protection from, having the public look at their notes and their records. The court, they didn't define that in the law though, and then the courts got to interpret what the word judiciary meant, and they interpreted it as being every single office of the administrative branches of all of the Illinois courts, which are not subject to FOIA. So you can't FOIA the Cook County Clerk's office, you cannot FOIA your local clerk's office, and it is completely wild, and it doesn't make any sense. It is an esoteric problem. It's hard to get people super excited about, but it's something that I'm always working on in Springfield in terms of trying to get really good data from our court system, because also, if you don't subject people to FOIA and people don't think they're going to have their data looked at, they don't keep it in a way that can be indexed, right? Like, one of the things that public access helps us with is making sure that our government actually keeps records that make sense. And our courts don't. Oh God, they don't. It's unbelievable. So that's a big place that Illinois has to catch up. And I think it's a bipartisan issue. Everybody should be for it. It's just a matter of getting it done.
Okay, and so now you led me down that path a little bit. It is a big state. There's 102 counties in there, and I think they all have different computer systems and everything.
Yes, they do.
And obviously, we'd like to have something that's working and can work, I would think, pretty much, across the state, maybe. So now we're talking about an investment too, I would think, within the court system. What is the reaction there? What would it take would that work?
I've been working on this a lot because of We do bond reform work. We also do fines and fees work. So that's a big focus in Appleseed, is reducing, that we do at Appleseed, is to reduce the use of, fines and fees for poor people who are moving through the system. The reason bail, but over time, those fines and fees and bail have started to be used to fund our court systems, actually, especially in smaller counties. This isn't a problem in Cook County, but I heard a Lake County out there and a McHenry. You guys are in a lot more trouble. Our court systems are very often almost purely funded sort of on the backs of poor people. Fines, money bond, and we don't have a revenue stream that flows directly into our courts from our counties. And I think everybody knows it's not like our counties are going to be able to just flip that back on. We'll have to have state transition dollars, and California has done this. It can be done. Basically, you got to take money out of the state budget and fund counties to get through the transition. We can get there. We just have to be able to, do it in an organized fashion. And we have to fund counties to adopt a uniform data system. One of the big parts of the bail bill that we're working on, the Pretrial Fairness Act, there's a whole section that no one cares about, but like me and 3 other people, it's all about this. That's about how do we get all of the counties on the same system? How do we figure out what they already have so we can take the data they already have and actually use it? How much time is that going to take? So, it's a long negotiation with everybody to figure out, delayed effective dates. It's going to take years to get this done. But if we don't start now, it'll just take more years. So ultimately, it's something that I think that, I hope everyone could agree that more data is always good. And so, it's always something I'm very focused on.
Yeah, well, I do agree. I think you can't really move forward unless you know what the data, what it shows and what it may, what intervention show, which brings me to drug treatment too, for some of the interventions. Indicated the research shows that, I guess, put through in the courts, it doesn't seem to work.
Yeah, I went quickly on that. It was sort of, and I could do a whole presentation, but it's interesting stuff. Essentially, when we use drug arrests to force people into treatment, they do the treatment, right? Because otherwise they can't get out of jail, but it doesn't stick. And it's, it's frustrating because we all always, of course, wish that if we just made people do a program, then they'd be ready to change their lives. And the reality is that's not how it works. People are ready to change when people are ready to change. And the problem is that we're often sort of turning people off to treatment. We're associating treatment with punishment. We're also just spending a lot of our treatment dollars in the criminal justice system instead of giving access to voluntary treatment. So like most of my youth, all of my youth, it was impossible for the kids, the juveniles. There was no community-based drug treatment in North Lawndale that was not run by the juvenile courts. If I needed my kids to get, most of my kids needed trauma treatment, they didn't need drug treatment. Like most of them were self-medicating with marijuana for PTSD, and that was what they were really dealing with. But I had some kids where that was not the case. They had various pill addictions that they don't use cocaine and heroin anymore. It's a whole, I've learned more than I ever want to know about various kinds of MDMA and other crazy drugs. But, I did have some kids who really needed drug treatment, serious detox drug treatment. And you had to get arrested. It was wild. And that's really the case. That's, again, it's the case in Chicago, and it's really the case downstate.
Yeah.
Almost no access.
Problems with downstate in particular.
Yeah.
So let me see, I've got a few other questions here. Somebody was asking about electronic monitoring in the reduction of incarcerations.
This is great. Now you're naming all of the things that I could do a whole other presentation on, because that's
for everybody's time and yours too, Sarah, we're probably about 7 or 8 minutes.
Yeah, that's what I figured. So electronic monitoring, when I left my job, I worked with so many guys who were on electronic monitoring. I promised when I went to Policy World that I would fix it, because the system drove us all so crazy that I promised that I'd fix it. Electronic monitoring is very expensive. in comparison to letting people free, it is not evidence-based. I think it would be fair to say that there has not been a lot of research on what does and doesn't work as far as electronic monitoring, but what there has not been heartening. And so we're using electronic monitoring in a very broad way, and in a lot of very different ways without thinking about what actually works. In Cook County in particular, but elsewhere too, we usually use it as a house arrest system. We use it as a way to lock people in their homes. And that just isn't, that creates a lot of the same harms that incarceration does, and then doesn't give the same benefits that letting people free would give them. So there's often, it's not the worst of both worlds, it's better than jail, but it really isn't a particularly effective policy intervention. So working on that data and that research, I think, I'm in the middle of a research paper on it. I know like 3 other people who are in the middle of major research projects on it. Hopefully we will have some more of that data. Like, keep an eye out in like 2022.
Well, thank you. And you know what? We want your data too. We want everything. And some people are for some of the bill numbers coming up. Some of the bills.
Yeah, well, and it's been a weird year. I don't know if anyone's noticed.
Oh, no.
So Springfield's in a little bit more disarray than it sometimes is. So usually I would be here with like a big long list of all these bill numbers for you to support. And right now we like are pretty sure that veto session is going to happen. Like I think that, you know, stuff's going to move through Springfield very quickly in November, and then hopefully we will regroup in January with some sanity.
I've heard that too about the veto session too. Yeah. So let's see, restorative justice is basically for nonviolent crime. Is that pretty much the reading of that?
So currently it is basically used for nonviolent crime. I think that most practitioners would say that, like, who do the work very deeply, would say that it is actually most useful for violent crime. We don't allow it for violent crime in any real way, right? I mean, if you get arrested for armed robbery, it doesn't matter if the victim wants to go through a restorative process, you're still going to get prosecuted, right? I know people who have, and in fact, there's been amazing work with people who have gone through circles with the families of people that they murdered. Actually, if you go on the We Are Witnesses site where KJ's video came from, Xavier McElrath Bay is an amazing activist where that's his story. He murdered someone when he was 13 years old. In general, restorative justice requires sort of understanding the depth of the harm you've caused. And sometimes with nonviolent crime, there just like isn't a lot to get. You know, that it actually, which is probably a good reason to think that maybe we shouldn't criminalize these things in the first place, but I don't actually think it's particularly effective for nonviolent crime. I think it's better than the criminal justice system, and I will always work for things that reduce harm, but its real power is in real harm, in the stuff that, I think the stuff that we're most hesitant to use it for is exactly where we should be looking to see if we can heal communities.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said, and I've gotten a lot of nice comments here in the chat that you need to know. Everyone is very appreciative for you spending your time here. And by the way, this will be recorded, and it will be on our League of Women Voters PalatineArea.org
website.
Right? Yeah, website in about a week or so, or a couple of days. We've been
early next week under videos.
Okay.
And I've had some people ask about having access to the slides.
Wouldn't that be all under the record?
Well, I mean, it's recorded, which includes the slides, but some people were wondering if they could just see the slides separately.
Yes, I will email it to you. I finished it about 20 minutes before I started here, so I didn't have time to email you before, but I'll send it now.
Well, we'd love to have it. And sure. I just want to point out too, I think it was just in the paper yesterday where they had this Reverend Donovan Price, a pastor on the south side of Chicago. Do you know, Sarah?
Yeah, that name is familiar.
Yeah, he talks about going to all of these violent crimes across, all the time. But he said it's a systemic mix of long-term issues It's racial issues, education issues, parental supervision, and the lack of, therefore, social ills, post-traumatic stress disorder. Hurt people hurt people. We have a whole generation of hurt kids.
It's so true. I mean, I learned a lot just about PTSD when I was working with kids. I also got PTSD because secondary trauma is very real and you really have to take it seriously. You know, we have to treat it as a mental and neurological problem and talk about how to fix it that way. One of the things that is the most frustrating to me is that one of the most effective and evidence, sort of proven uses for medical marijuana is for adults with PTSD. Works great. I know that sounds like crazy, but it actually is a very effective treatment. So we've got all of these kids out there with PTSD who are smoking marijuana, which works, but also is not good for their brains, and we want them to use something else. And instead of treating their trauma, we punish them for smoking pot. And it just, again, things that just drove me up the wall, that's a huge one. And I think that, thinking about recognizing what PTSD is, in younger boys, it mimics ADHD, which is a huge problem because we get a lot of kids being put on Ritalin for PTSD symptoms, which makes it worse. So there's a lot of education about mental health that we need to do for our judges and our educators.
Yeah, it's really, but we can reinvest, which I like that you brought up, from money somewhere else, and we can do it there. Yep. So I will be, we'll be finishing up now, and I have to say thank you for everybody that came in tonight and continuing to learn. This is a lot, because criminal justice system, what I found, and Sarah, you would say it too, they're all silos too. And we need to talk together, and we need to share data and evidence, and we got to start breaking down the silos and start doing what really works, because obviously what we're doing now is not working. But thank everybody. Please participate. We'd like to get our consensuses done by mid-January. And so if you need some help, reach out. All of us on the team are right here to help you. And we have access to great minds too. So thanks everyone. Have a good night.